Hello Street Snappers, Brian here with another street photography video. And as you know, this channel is 100% street, and today I'm not going to let you down. So today's video is all about shooting the streets at night. There's no doubt that there's some great street photography to be had during the hours of darkness, and night shooting is something we should all try. It's almost a rite of passage. Think neon lights, shop windows, reflections, car lights, bars, restaurants, people having fun, street lighting, reflections from pavements, from windows. There is plenty of material to explore. So in this video, we're going to look at some of the essential techniques that will help you become a confident and proficient night shooter. I'm a regular night shooter, particularly between probably late October and late March, when we just have a bigger window of opportunity with more hours of darkness. You can shoot in any town or city where there are strong light sources, and this works just as well in small towns as it does in big cities like London or New York or Rome or Paris. Personally, I love shooting in London's West End, particularly Soho and Chinatown, where there are loads of bright colours, lots of sparkling lights, vibrant neon everywhere. And there's no reason that shooting in the dark should be any more difficult than daylight shooting. But as well as the aesthetic issues, there are some different technical and practical considerations to take into account, which we're going to have a look at shortly. So here are my top tips for shooting the streets at night. Firstly, you need to find good light. Just like any form of photography, or any form of street photography, night shooting is all about utilising good or interesting or usable light. And at night we have to be super aware of where the good light is. And this is one of the most important factors in nighttime street shooting, second only to finding a decent subject, obviously. My own approach is often to identify a good light source first and then build a composition around that. But what exactly is what is good light? What do I mean by good light? Well, I try to seek out light sources that give me depth to my image. I want decent contrast with well-defined areas of light and dark, particularly dark, like the chiaroscuro effect in painting. So this image is quite flat and lacking in contrast. There's maybe even too much detail. And this could look like a daylight shot almost. Whereas this one has much more of a sense of mood and maybe mystery. So try to stop and think about the intensity, the direction, the colour of light, the light source, and how it falls on the scene around you or on potential subjects. Watch how the light changes as you move around it, observe reflections and shadows, and see the impact of changing light patterns such as car lights. You'll find that you're starting to behave like a moth, seeking out the lights and becoming drawn to them all the time. And this is really good. In fact, that's a great tip, be a moth. Then leading on from this is my second tip, which is you need to understand the effects of the light. You've found the good light. Let's say you've found that perfect light source. You now need to really understand what it is you're working with. Is it hard light or soft light? Maybe start by asking yourself, what do you want the picture to say? What sort of mood or feel are you aiming to create? Now look at that light source. Does it suit the mood? Are the shadows sharp or less well defined? Is the light high or low intensity? What's the temperature of the light like? Is it warm or is it cool? So, for example, if you're aiming to shoot a moody, atmospheric, maybe slightly provocative shot in, say, Soho, then a darkish, soft, red light source would suit your needs perfectly. Remember that bigger light sources are more likely to be soft, and shooting with a wide aperture will help soften them more. Light from a big shop window, for example, could act like a giant softbox, providing a much wider, even area of very diffuse light. Another factor to bear in mind is the spread of the light. How does it cover your subject? Does it focus on a small spot like a spotlight, or does it give an overall broadly spread pattern? And personally, I quite like using uneven light, which gives form and depth to the image, where you have well-defined areas of both light and shadow. And I love big dark areas in night shooting. I love the shadow parts of a frame. But hang on, having said all that, if we're agonizing over the quality and the effects of the light, are we missing the moment? And isn't that what all street photography is all about, the moment? Well, kind of yes and no. And there's a bit of a compromise here. If you're the sort of street photographer who's driven by the moment, as I guess I am, there's no doubt that moments will be harder to find at night. So I start to explore other approaches and tend to adopt a more aesthetically driven approach. And by the way, if you want to hear more about these different approaches to street photography, these different ways of working, do have a look at my earlier video, and I'll pop a link up here. So my next thought is that I really must slow down. I've got to slow down at night to really absorb and become part of the nighttime street life. You've got to slow right down, stopping frequently to take in your surroundings, watching the light and just waiting for that scene to evolve. And I find myself probably lingering for longer than I would do during the day. You've probably heard of the fishing technique. I've mentioned it before, and I'm not a big fan of the fishing technique because I don't really have the patience. But I do find that it's more productive at night, particularly when I found that perfect light source. So so you find a good spot and stay there. Just stay there. Let the image come to you and trust that patience will pay off, and it will. And another point on this whole thing about slowing down, you may well be using a slower than ideal shutter speed. So actually stopping to take a picture and being really still is now more important than ever. So let's now have a look at camera settings, which at night change. The first thing to bear in mind is that I don't think twice about whacking up the ISO, and I'm usually shooting at least 3200 by default. And with a camera like my X Pro 3 here, shooting high as a breeze. Most modern cameras can really handle high ISO with ease. So I'm happy to go up to 6400, even 12800 if I need to. I'd much rather have a little bit of noise than a shot that is ruined because of blur. So in terms of the actual settings, mine goes something like this. It's aperture priority. Then I open up the lens to the maximum aperture. I love shooting wide open at night. So I ideally have a fast prime lens that will open up to f1.4 or even wider. And I'm playing with an f1 lens at the moment, which is quite incredible for this sort of stuff. So then I set the ISO to auto, but with a minimum shutter speed stipulated of a 30th of a second. I'll set in the ISO range in the auto ISO setting in the menu. I will probably set the lower end of the range to something like 800 because I'm not going to go any lower than 800. And I'll set the high point to the maximum, so something like 12,800. So within that range, it will go as high as it likes. Now, some people struggle to get their head around this, believing that noise will be an issue. Well, it needn't be. It can sometimes even add to the atmosphere. And the alternative, a blurred or a massively underexposed image, is simply not an option. And I completely accept that for many photographers, turning up your ISO to these levels is like signing a pact with the devil. But trust me, you do sometimes need to do it, and it won't ruin your pictures. As for other settings, I always shoot in RAW at night. I set the dynamic range to 100 and white balance to auto. And because I'm shooting in RAW, I can sort it out later in post if there's an issue with, say, color temperature. Because you've got to bear in mind at night, we're working with all kinds of mixed light sources, mixed qualities of light. So it's really hard to nail it, to get it right with the white balance. So just set it to auto and tweak it later. And on the subjects of settings, I tend to use manual focusing at night, as autofocus can be a little bit slow and you could end up missing the moment because it's taking too long to lock onto your subject. And you'll find that with practice, this becomes quick and easy. I usually switch the focus peaking on, speeds things up a bit, and I usually have it set to the red highlights. As for lenses, well, it's probably worth experimenting with different lenses. I tend to shoot only with primes because they're usually smaller, lighter, the image quality is usually better, they have a wider maximum aperture, so there's a lot going for primes. And in my bag for shooting at night, I usually have 2 or 3 primes, typically an f1.2, 56mm 1.2, which is 85 equivalent full frame terms, a 35mm 1.4, which is 50mm, and a 23mm f1.4, which gives me 35 in full frames. So it gives me a range of, in full frame terms, of 35 to 85mm, which is plenty. And I find that most of my subject matter falls within this range. And I also have the option of shooting with really wide apertures for some beautiful effects with the light. And if you saw my earlier video about Saul Leiter and his work, again, I'll pop a link up here. You'll see that he regularly shot with a longer lens, typically 90mm and sometimes up to 150mm. And this can produce a really stunning aesthetic at night. So if I could choose only one lens for night shooting, it would probably be the 35mm 1.4, 50mm equivalent. And it's just a terrific lens for night shooting. It's a really good all-rounder. So moving on from gear, one thing I like about shooting at night is creating a sense of mystery. The nighttime is dark, it's foreboding, it's sometimes scary, it's often mysterious. So we have the perfect opportunity to bring some of that mystery to our images. Leaving the viewer to think, leaving the viewer thinking, what if? Rather than giving them all the answers, all the information immediately. It's sometimes best to get them to think a little, to have them form their own conclusions about what's behind that door, who's through that window, what's in that gap, and so on. And this whole concept of holding something back, not revealing everything in a scene, is one of the things that will help you create that sense of mystery at night. So that leads me on to think about your style, and maybe you should think about developing a style for your night shooting. Please don't be that person who has a random collection of unconnected images of the streets at night. There's got to be more of a focus to your work. There really should be a kind of glue which holds your images together as a body of work, your body of work. And one of the ways to do this, and you'll have heard me bang on about this before, is to shoot in projects where there's a strong theme that binds the objects together, a glue. And I produced a video about this earlier this year about how to work with projects, again link here, and stand by for an update on that video. I'll be doing a longer, more in-depth one about projects very soon. So I won't go into that in any great detail here. Or you could develop a more stylized approach to your work, which has your own look, which identifies you as the photographer. And here's a good example of that. This is someone I follow on Instagram, Paula Franchi, and her link is below. And her style is admittedly based on post-production, okay, but it does have a very distinctive stylized look. And I should mention that whilst I'm not totally against this, producing this kind of effect in post, and I think Paula's work is really quite nice, I think you do need to be careful about going over the top with it and becoming a bit of a one-trick pony where all of your images look the same. So it's something you can use, but just treat it with a bit of caution. So another thing you can consider at night is to, or you should consider, is to aim for dark images. You're probably thinking, well, that's obvious. I'm shooting at night. They're bound to be dark. Well, not necessarily. If we're taking pictures at night, they need to look as though they've been taken at night. Digital cameras have a tendency to want to brighten things up. They think it's helping us by giving us a nicely exposed scene. But the danger is that a night shot can end up looking like a daytime shot. And this is where your exposure compensation dial comes in handy. And I nearly always deliberately underexpose at night, and that sounds counterintuitive, I know, but I underexpose. And I often dial in my exposure compensation dial, a value of -1, sometimes more, sometimes even -2. This usually does the trick, and it gives me deep shadows, areas that are almost too dark to comprehend, but the highlights are still there. The highlights are in check and you can see the picture, but it looks like a nighttime picture. Another thing that I look out for at night is windows. In most towns and cities, we are surrounded by windows, and street shooting at night lends itself perfectly to using layers as a mean to add volume and depth to your images. Again, I won't go into layers in too much detail here, but you may like to see an earlier video that I did about layers, and again, there's a link here. So maybe use shop windows or cafe windows, restaurant windows that are reflecting the lights outside, or which perhaps have moisture in them, which can produce a great effect. And taking a cue from one of Saul Leiter's images, in this shot, I focused on the glass and let the background go to blur, producing this kind of semi-abstracted view of the restaurant. And remember, if you're shooting through a window, you have several levels of depth to play with. You have what's behind the window in the shop or the bar or whatever. You have the glass itself. You have anything on that glass, such as moisture or writing. Then you have what's being reflected, which could be lights, people, anything. So you have at least 4 planes here, and you need to decide which is the most important for your composition. What needs to be in focus, what needs to be correctly exposed, what needs to be correctly lit. But you do need to make sure your frame isn't just a mess of random shapes and patterns. There needs to be some sense, some cohesion to it all. And on the subject of reflections, rain can also be great for nighttime street photography. I love shooting at night in the wet. All the wet surfaces, particularly on busy roads, will catch the colours of the surrounding lights, creating a really dramatic effect. Also look out for strong shapes such as big hats or umbrellas. Umbrellas with rain on them can give you a really interesting, beautiful aesthetic. So, just finishing up, I really couldn't end this without alluding to the issue of safety, which needs to step up a level at night, to be honest. I've never had an issue, but I'm just conscious that I need to take more care at night, and I take more care than I would do during the day. You're just a little bit more vulnerable and exposed. You don't know who's in those shadows, and you need to be aware of who's around you, what they're doing, and just have a plan B, have an escape route in mind, just in case things go a bit wrong. But don't let that put you off. In my experience, they haven't gone wrong, but if they do, I'm prepared for it. So I wouldn't go down dark, quiet alleys alone that look dodgy, and I'd probably stick to busier areas. Shooting with a buddy or in a small group is sometimes the best option. It doesn't really work for me. I like to do this solo, but you do what works for you. So if you'd like to read more about these tips for night shooting, I've made them available on my blog for you, and I've put a link down below, so do have a click if you want to read a hard copy. Finally, I run night shooting workshops in London on Friday and Saturday evenings for small groups, and you can find this on the website in the links below. And finally, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all next time. Bye for now.